Finding a good pad controller is much harder than buying a good arcade stick. Not only is it more complicated to build, but people expect pads to be cheap. And when you build something to be cheap, it usually ends up garbage. Well, fortunately for you, Pro controllers are the new normal, and that means at the cost of being more expensive, we finally have an option that you can really get excited about. This is the Victrix Pro BFG. The Victrix Pro BFG is the first pad-style Pro controller to bear the Victrix Pro name, and since Victrix became a part of PDP, they've been very careful not to use that title carelessly. Although last year's Gambit controller had the Victrix badge on it, it wasn't part of the Pro lineup, and for good reason. This year's Pro BFG may look like the Gambit on the surface, but it's better in every conceivable way, especially because of these removable modules. Where the Gambit forced you to use the D-pad in the offset position, also known as the wrong position, the Pro BFG allows you to flip the module around so it's in the perfect place for everyone. And even though that alone would have made it Controller of the Year, Victrix added one more module that transforms the Pro BFG into a completely different form factor, a hand-over 6-button Fightpad. Fightpads that use a 6-button layout are nothing new, but being able to switch between handheld mode and Fightpad mode is more useful than you might imagine. For example, when playing an anime fighting game, you might want 3 or 4 face buttons for attacks and use the shoulder buttons for macros like dashing or bursts. But when you're playing a 2D fighter more like Street Fighter 5, you've got 3 punches and 3 kicks, and so you may prefer to fight with a Fightpad attachment which has 6 buttons on the front, so you can use all your fingers like this instead of splitting it up between your thumb for these 4 buttons and your fingers for the shoulder buttons. This makes it easier to press 2-button combinations for things like EX moves and V trigger, or 3-button combinations for V reversals. The buttons aren't as big as the ones you get on a full-sized arcade stick, but double tapping aside, this Fightpad attachment can do many of the same things. When you think of something like a Nintendo Switch Pro controller, all you're really getting is a controller that's fully featured, as opposed to the Joy-Cons, which are unique but better suited for things like casual gaming. But Pro controllers for esports like the Pro BFG come with so many extras, it's much more like something James Bond might be handed before a mission. I mean, just look at this case. If you didn't know it was a controller already, then I doubt most people would be able to guess there was a controller inside, and when you do actually open it up, you see all these textured surfaces, which remind you more of materials like carbon fiber. Molded compartments house all the modular parts you can swap into the Pro BFG, which itself looks like a weapon, with its matte black casing, and then underneath you find a hidden compartment with even more modular parts, like the analog stick sniper extension, and you'd be forgiven for thinking these were extra bullets or something. Now, before we go any further, there's an elephant in the room that we have to address with any gamepad review, and it's this, the D-pad. Sure, with most first-person shooters, you're only going to be using this to select different weapons, but Victrix is known for their arcade sticks and their gaming headsets. So, by including something like a Fightpad module for the Victrix Pro BFG, Victrix is declaring that this controller is going to be good enough for fighting games. Well, I'm pretty hard to please when it comes to D-pads, and honestly, last year's Gambit wasn't exactly my favorite. So when the Pro BFG was announced and it looked almost exactly the same as the Gambit, I was understandably skeptical, but after one short play session with the Pro BFG, this is what I had to say on Twitter. Oh shit, I think this controller I'm testing might be the one. But how can this be? With the Victrix Pro BFG looking so much like last year's Victrix Gambit controller, how can I like the D-pad controller on this? Well, the answer lies in this modular system which allows you to flip it around and do this. See, most of what I didn't like about the Gambit came from the fact that it placed the D-pad in the offset position. It was flat and I could press my thumb all the way and still not actuate the down position, which naturally made almost all movement and motion inputs difficult. But on the Pro BFG, you can actually flip the module around to put the D-pad in the regular, non-goofy position. And this one simple feature changes everything else about this controller, especially the ergonomics. Now I can use my thumb in a comfortable, non-outstretched position, and I'm not forced to hit down on the D-pad with the fleshy part of my thumb, which on the Gambit I endearingly referred to as the zone of uncertainty. When you try out your regular combos with the BFG, instantly feel how much easier it is to make everything connect, because it's just working with you as opposed to against you. I feel like when I played with the Gambit controller from last year, everything I was trying to do, it was just getting in my way. But the positioning here on the BFG is just so much better. It's like the D-pad is Sleeping Beauty and it's just waiting for my thumb to come and give it the kiss of life. And it doesn't stop there. If you prefer to rest your thumb in the middle of the D-pad and just slide, rock, and roll around in the most efficient way possible, just pull off this D-pad cover and replace it with the concave diamond-shaped one. Still not good enough? The Pro BFG comes with a brand new third D-pad cover that combines the best of both worlds, offering a concave circular cover with the main cardinal directions most prominent and scooped out curves for the diagonals in between. Honestly speaking, it sometimes takes me weeks to finally get used to the D-pads on some of these controllers I review, but literally on day one I was quite prepared to announce my undying fidelity to the Pro BFG. But that's when it suddenly started to go terribly wrong. See, a Pro controller is more complicated to design than an arcade stick. It has to be ergonomic, these handles can't jut out too far, it can't be too light, and these buttons have to be spaced just right to fit all different sizes of thumb. There's just so much that can go wrong with the design of these controllers, and the D-pad is usually where most of these Pro controllers fail to give fighting game players the attention they deserve. The Pro BFG is a surprisingly big leap ahead of its predecessor, the Gambit, but something I just couldn't do consistently at the start was hit the diagonals. I'd go for an instant air dash, which is done by tapping forward jump, releasing the D-pad, and then tapping forward, but for some reason I would randomly miss the forward jump and end up jumping straight up instead. Now the truth is, this is something that can happen on almost any D-pad, and even though I prefer an arcade stick in a situation like this diagonal jumping issue is something you can learn to get around. Switching back to this regular D-pad attachment kind of helped at first, but after some practice I figured out the nuances of making it work on these flat D-pad covers as well. If you don't push directly down on this diagonal portion, then it won't actually actuate the up and the sideways direction at the same time, giving you either neutral up or just a sideways direction instead of a diagonal. The other thing is that you can actually press on a diagonal portion of this flat D-pad cover and not get a diagonal, because if you're pushing up, you're using the friction of the D-pad to push up a little bit, then it will actuate up instead of the diagonal. And so you have to make sure that you're pushing directly down on this portion, and actually it kind of helps if you slightly push a little bit closer to the sideways portion. So for now this is pretty much the norm for D-pad technology, but maybe one day a company will come around and make a D-pad that's a bit more like an arcade stick. SNK. Anyway, once I realized that the diagonals issue wasn't nearly as bad as I initially thought, I got right back into testing the controller more, and man, there is a lot to like here. Holding it normally, it feels like all the buttons are in the right places. The module on the right can only be swapped out for the Fightpad, and it can't be flipped upside down, but that's fine because I've never heard of anyone who needed such a layout. The buttons on the regular module feel a lot like the Gambit, which I didn't like at first because they're stiff compared to maybe a PS5 pad, but I actually got used to it and quite like them now. The triggers too are more or less the same as what you get on the Gambit, meaning they have a big gun trigger shape, which I feel is unnecessary for a fighting game, but this too, I just kinda got used to and didn't think about it too much. Much like the Gambit, it has multi-position clutch triggers, so you can choose between a long throw, a hair trigger, or somewhere in between. I know they're proud of their patented design, but honestly I find it pretty difficult to lock the clutch in place when I'm using any of the in-between positions, so I wish they were just a simple selector switch instead. But being able to switch between long throw and hair trigger is easy, and I really appreciate being able to do that. Now if you take the original module out and you replace it with this, the Fightpad module, the thing is you can hold this controller in either of two different ways. The regular way with your hands like this, or you can play with your hand over like this. There are 6 buttons here on the front instead of 4, but secondly, they're very clicky. And that's because the regular module just uses membrane buttons, which is the sort of thing you find in most controllers like your PS5 DualSense or your Xbox controllers. But using clicky switches for your action buttons is something that people have been trying more and more with these Fightpad controllers. And personally, I think it's a bit of a poor decision because you can't really hit them from a high distance now. Because they've got such a short throw distance, you really are just expected to rest your fingers on top of them and click a bit like you would click on a mouse. But if you've had any experience with fighting games, you'll know that there's quite a lot of gymnastics going along with pressing buttons like this. It kind of messes up my timing when I'm trying to press multiple buttons at the same time for things like reversals or for EX moves. Anyway, there have been companies that made fight pads which had mechanical switches that didn't have a tactile click, and I much preferred that kind of design. That doesn't at all mean that these micro switch buttons in the Fightpad module are difficult to use. I would just prefer if micro switches were put in the D-pad instead. Now, if you plan to use it in the hand over position, you'll no longer be holding it securely securely, so you'll have to rest the Pro BFG on a table or on your leg. Fortunately, the Pro BFG handles are less like gun handles and more like a boomerang, so resting it on your leg doesn't tilt the controller too far forward. I did find that the R2 trigger can get pressed accidentally when using it on my leg, so I recommend unmapping it if possible in-game. Something I couldn't do is remap or unmap the shoulder buttons on the controller itself though. You can remap or entirely unmap the 4 back buttons on the fly, and apparently for the final release of the product, they'll have PC software that you could use to do this too. But as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to allow you to remap the face buttons, the D-pad, or the shoulder buttons. This is a huge shame because when using the Fightpad module, you potentially have 10 buttons available to use with just your right hand, which is super handy in a fighting game with good macro support. But as it stands, you can't remap the shoulder buttons, which means you just have R1 and R2 in 2 different places. And come to think of it, I don't even know if that's tournament legal because usually you're only allowed to have 1 button per input. Anyway, Victrix, I know you're listening, so if you could do a firmware update in the future to make it possible to remap the shoulder buttons or the action buttons in the D-pad, I would very much appreciate that. The back buttons are actually pretty useful on the left side of the controller particularly, because when you're using the hand over position for the Fightpad, you no longer have easy access to the right side shoulder buttons. So if you're careful with your grip, you can still have access to 10 action buttons even in this position. What's more interesting, however, is that the Pro BFG can be set to double any of the normal buttons or even the D-pad directions. So yes, you can definitely do some shortcuts and varying levels of cheating using this controller, but I'll save that for a separate video. Talking of which, be sure that you're subscribed so that you get notified when that video goes up. The analog sticks on the Pro BFG are pretty much the same as on the Gambit, and the octagonal gates work quite well here too. When I tried them on the Gambit, I felt the throw distance was too long for the octagonal gate to be of much use, unless you do what's known as riding the gate, but that's too much effort if you ask me. Trying it again here on the Pro BFG, I'm actually starting to like them more. I still don't think I'd use the analog stick for fighting games, but I know that some of you maniacs out there do, so yeah, knock yourself out. Alright guys, I'm gonna wrap things up there because honestly speaking, I could make 10 videos about the Victrix Pro BFG, but the basic lowdown is this. It's a pro controller that you can also use like a Fightpad, and it comes in $20 cheaper than what we're expecting for the PlayStation DualSense Edge controller, which is coming out later this year. That being said, the PlayStation DualSense Edge won't have a lot of the features that you find here on the Pro BFG. First of all, the Fightpad module. Secondly, the module that you can flip upside down on the left side, which is the D-pad and the analog stick, which you could have in the offset position or in the regular position. You also have the flexibility of these D-pad covers, which you can remove and choose from one of 3 different D-pad covers, and these octagonal restrictor gates, which you can choose to put on the analog sticks or just the regular circular gates. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that you won't get on the Pro BFG that I really love about the DualSense controller. For example, any kind of haptic feedback whatsoever, and my favorite feature, adaptive triggers here on these shoulder buttons. But these are trade-offs that I think make perfect sense, and it makes the purchasing decision a little bit simpler. If you need those fancy DualSense features, this is the controller you have to go for. But if you want a ridiculously over-the-top modular pro controller that also doubles as a 6-button Fightpad, with the option of swapping the layout so that it's goofy or regular, a wired connection or a wireless dongle that allows you to plug into tournament setups without having to faff around with the built-in Bluetooth pairing system, and convenient stuff like a tournament lockout mode that prevent you from accidentally pausing the game and disqualifying yourself in the middle of a match. Well, honestly, if that stuff means anything to you, then look no further, because the Victrix Pro BFG is probably going to be right up your alley. If you found this review interesting, then you're definitely going to want to check this controller out too, so click right here to watch that video right now. Remember to like this video, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and be sure to leave a comment if you've got any specific questions about this controller. That's all for now. I'll see you very, very soon.